as we look at skin and membranes, I want you to remember back to the major tissue types we just talked about and see how many of those you can identify. There'll be some places where I'll show you examples of, for instance, stratified squamous epithelial or muscle tissue. But be aware that these tissues make up the organs, and the skin is our largest organ. So let's begin by talking about the skin itself. So the skin is the integument. It's the largest organ of the integumentary system. The integumentary system includes the skin, which has two layers: the outermost epidermis, which is made of stratified squamous epithelial cells, and the deeper dermis, which is dense, irregular connective tissue. That means that you have connective tissues running in many different directions, the fibers in many different directions, so that the skin can pull and tug and move without tearing, and to connect that epidermis to the underlying fatty tissue, adipose, that then helps to connect to the bone. In addition to the skin itself, we have appendages or accessory organs such as your hair, your fingernails and toenails. You have glands that secrete oil, your sebaceous glands, and your sudoriferous or sweat glands, and we'll see there are two types of those. And there's muscle tissue, the erector pili. In addition to this, you're going to have nerve receptors and blood vessels, and we'll see some of those as we look at some of the organs. So your integument, your skin, consists of the epidermis, the dermis, and all of the accessory appendages. All right, so remember we talked about squamous epithelial tissue, and I showed you this very image, but just a little bit differently. I wanted you to be able to relate these images to what you've seen already. So if you look down on the surface of squamous epithelial cells, remember you're going to see sort of flat, irregular shaped cells. Now this is showing you one layer looking from the top down onto the cells, right? So you're looking from an anterior view down onto the surface of the cells. So if we turn that on its side and you look at a section through cells, you'll see there are actually many layers of these flat cells that make up the epidermis. So the epidermis begins right here at this dark layer of cells. So you can see it is attached to a basement membrane. See that little sort of pinkish looking line there? And then you have connective tissues below that. So from here down is dermis, and from here up is epidermis. Layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of cells. Much more squashed or squamous in appearance as you get closer and closer and closer to the surface. Now we're also going to learn that the epidermis is made up of different layers. Each one has a different characteristic that we'll identify. But just from this first look, down here, these closest to the basement membrane look very different from these cells, which look very different from these cells. So these on the outer edge up here, all of these are dead cells. Yeah. All right. So in this image, you can see the layers of the skin with some of the accessory organs. So the outer layer here is the epidermis. Now it actually starts right about here where this dark layer is. You can see it very clearly if you look across here. All of that is epidermis and everything above it. So everything that is superficial is the epidermis. This layer is the dermis, and you can see you've got hair follicles with hair shafts growing out of them that are embedded in the dermis. You also will see, as we look a little bit closer at these, you're going to have some sweat glands and some oil glands. We'll see that in a much better image. So epidermis, epi means upon, the dermis, which is the larger layer made up of connective tissues. Here you have the hypodermis. Hypo means what? Exactly, under. So hypo, under the dermis. This is sometimes called the subcutaneous layer also. Sub, below, cutaneous, skin. So if you get a sub-Q injection, the needle is inserted into the subcutaneous area. And here you can also see the underlying muscle tissue. All right, so just an overview there as we begin looking at these. So when we think back to the epidermis, remember I talked about the way that the cells appear very differently depending on where they're located. That's because the cells are very different. The deepest layer is the stratum basale. Stratum simply means layer. Basale means base. So the deepest layer is one cell layer thick. It's attached to the basement membrane. You have keratinocytes, which are cells that produce keratin. Keratin helps to give a waterproof characteristic to the skin so that you don't gain or lose excess water. Now, keratin is a very, very tough waterproofing protein. These cells in the stratum basale are undergoing rapid mitosis because we're constantly losing cells as skin cells slough off. So in the stratum basale, you also have cells that are known as melanocytes that produce the pigment melanin that gives color to the skin. All right, so the stratum basale, the base layer, lots of keratinocytes undergoing rapid mitosis. Those cells are then going to be pushed upward toward the surface as new cells are being created. And then the cells that were in the stratum basale are pushed upward and become cells of the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum, think spiny. So these cells are sort of long and spindle shaped, and they begin to accumulate the keratin granules and help to form that waterproofing layer. So this layer of cells is usually many layers thick. Your stratum granulosum is the third layer from the bottom, and it's filled with granules. So you have little bags. Okay, remember granules granules are little pieces of something, and they can be contained in vesicles. And when you stain them, it looks very grainy. So you have the granules of the keratin, and you also have other protein products that are created in these cells, and they accumulate in the stratum granulosum. As these cells begin to die, those vesicles and the granules take up a lot of stain. So the stratum granulosum is a thinner layer that stains very dark. Your stratum lucidum, lucid means clear, so the stratum lucidum appears somewhat clear. This is only found in the thick skin. So your thickest skin is where? On the parts you use most, right? The palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So only in those two areas do you have that fourth layer, which is the stratum lucidum. And again, the cell layers are very, very thick and composed of dead cells. And then the most superficial layer is the stratum corneum, which is the outermost layers, and those are composed completely of dead cells. So those cells have lost the ability to maintain connections, and they don't adhere to each other anymore, so they are slopping off constantly. So you're losing cells of the stratum corneum constantly. If you don't believe me, vacuum your mattress with the little handheld attachment. Oh my gosh, it will freak you out at how many dead skin cells you vacuum up. I know, sort of gross, right? All right, so now let's look at this image and see if we can identify these structures that we talked about. All right, so here, this lighter area is the dermis. So it's the deep layer. This layer right here begins the epidermis. So the epidermis stretches from here all the way to the surface. So all of this is epidermis, right? The deepest layer is the one layer of stratum basale, also called the stratum germinativum, because it's where new cells are germinated. Then you have a thick layer of stratum spinosum. So the cells appear somewhat spiny or pointed, okay, so accumulating lots of keratin granules. You have the darker, thin layer of stratum granulosum, so just a few layers thick, and this is where a lot of dye will be deposited when you're creating the slides, because the cells are starting to die and the granules that have been liberated from the vesicles are going to accumulate a lot of stain. Superficial to that, one layer closest to the surface, you'll have the stratum lucidum, which appears somewhat clear. Now this one is not extremely clear. On some slides you can see it very obviously, but it will start to be very, very clear in appearance. You can somewhat see it a little bit better right in this area. And then the outermost layer in all skin layers is the stratum corneum. Remember, the lucidum is only found on the hands and the feet, but the corneum is the dead stuff. So all the skin you see is stratum corneum. You see all dead cells. Well, that'll make you think a little bit more about all these face creams and stuff, right? You can't fix dead cells. All right, so here you can see where the skin is tearing apart. Remember, these cells have lost the ability to maintain their integrity and their connections to each other, so this layer is constantly being shed. But remember, our stratum basale down here is constantly undergoing mitosis and new cells being pushed up, 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 up. All right. Now, all of these epithelial tissues are avascular, which means they don't have a blood supply. So they get their nutrients from the underlying blood vessels that will be down here in the dermis. So as these cells are being created and pushed farther and farther away from that blood supply, that's one of the main reasons these cells start to die. All right, let's continue. Whoa, too many. All right, so all of this from the dark purple area to the left is all going to be the epidermis, okay? The rest of all of this is dermis. So the dermis itself is made up of connective tissues, but it's further divided into two layers. The papillary layer, which is the layer closest to the epidermis, and it's composed of papillae. So papillae are finger-like projections. So notice how the dermis pokes up into the epidermis, and as it does so, it creates dermal ridges, which are finger-like projections that give us our pattern of fingerprints. The remaining part of the dermis is the reticular layer. So it's in the reticular layer that we find lots of blood vessels and nerve receptors such as the Pacinian corpuscle, and we find lots and lots of glands. Now what you're seeing here with all these little circles, these are cross sections, cuts through a tubular structure. We'll see these a little bit more. So it's the reticular layer that makes up about 80% of the dermis and is the origin of most of the appendages. Up here in the papillae, you also have some little nerve receptors that are called Meissner's corpuscles. Meissner's corpuscles can detect the sensation of very, very light touch because they're very close to the surface. Your much larger Pacinian corpuscles are receptors that are located deep in the dermis, and those are pressure receptors. They detect a firmer touch. All right, let's look at some of the other structures, beginning with the sebaceous glands. So sebaceous glands secrete sebum, which is an oil that acts as a lubricant. You find these all over the skin except in the palms and the soles. But what else is unique about the palms and the soles? No hair, right? So you don't need sebaceous glands to secrete sebum. So here you can see a hair follicle with a hair shaft growing out. Each one of these is a follicle, hair shafts growing inside. But if you look more toward the superficial surface, where the scalp would be located up here, right? Okay, so this is your epidermis, all of this is dermis. You can see that most of these hair follicles have a visible little bag attached to them. So that's how I describe these. If it looks like a bag that empties into a hair follicle, it's a bag of oil. These are sebaceous glands. They secrete into the hair follicle, and then that oil lubricates the hair shaft itself. So here you can see a much more magnified view. Here is the hair follicle, okay? That would be your sebaceous gland. It looks like a bag. Now I use that because we're going to talk in a few minutes about these other little structures that really don't look like bags. They look like little cuts through donuts. Those are not sebaceous glands. So to identify them, if it looks like a bag and it empties into a hair follicle, it's sebaceous. Whoa, too far. Okay, your sudoriferous, think odor. These are your sweat glands. So your sweat glands are going to secrete a watery fluid that contains waste products. Your eccrine sweat glands are the ones that you find all over your body, and they help just to regulate body temperature, so thermoregulation. You also have what are known as apocrine or apocrine sweat glands. Now, let's think about what the difference in these are. They're both sweat glands. They're secreting watery fluids with waste products, but what about on your upper lip when you first start sweating, or your face, or the surface of your forearm, or your chest, your stomach when you start sweating? That's just a thin, watery sweat, and it may be salty, but it doesn't stink, right? Those are your eccrine sweat glands. But how about those other ones? Your apocrine sweat glands are found in the axillary. Remember axillary? Correct. Underarm. And urogenital and anal area. Okay? So around the external genitalia and the anus, you have sweat glands that do stink. These are your eccrine sweat glands. Okay? So if it makes you smell like an ape, it's apocrine. If it's just watery, thin sweat, it's eccrine. Now, when you look at these on a microscope or using a microscope, so you're looking at the histology of the tissues, you can't identify if it is eccrine or apocrine. What you can identify is that it looks sort of like little tubular structures, and that tells you it's a sweat gland, not a sebaceous gland. Okay, so let's look at the model here. There you can see a coiled up little gland. It's going to secrete through a duct. That is a sweat gland. Okay, if it is an apocrine sweat gland, it will secrete into a hair follicle. I'm looking to see if I see one here. That's going to be a sebaceous gland. That's a sebaceous gland. There's your Pacinian corpuscle. So no, I don't see an apocrine gland here. But when you're looking at the histology, if it looks like coiled up little cuts through tubular structures, it's going to be sudoriferous. I won't ask you to tell me by looking at the tissue if it is apocrine or eccrine. But they're both sudoriferous. Okay. Wow, I keep jumping ahead. All right, so the hair itself grows in a hair follicle. Okay, so the follicle is the container. The hair shaft grows from the root, which is the deeper part of the hair follicle. You find hair everywhere on the body except your palms, your soles, your nipples. Now, only the part that extends off the body is the nipple. The rounded part is the areola. So the rounded part that is on the breast itself is areola. The round flat part, the nipple itself, does not have hair. Your lips don't have hair. And there are parts of your external genitalia that don't have hair as well. But wherever you have hair, regardless the type of hair, it grows from a hair follicle. And the hair itself is the shaft. In addition to that, there are smooth muscles that attach to the hair follicle. Here you can see a smooth muscle that's going to attach to this hair follicle. There's a sebaceous gland There's a sudoriferous gland. See how different all that looks, right? But these little hairs, as you can see very clearly here and here, these little muscles that you can see very clearly, these attach to the hair follicles and they're called erector pili. When these smooth muscles contract, this is what gives you goosebumps. All right, so while we're talking about skin, let's talk let's try that again. Let's talk briefly about a very common damage to the skin, and that is burns. Burns are classified based on how much tissue is damaged, how deep is the damage. A first-degree burn, such as a sunburn, as you see in the picture here on the left, is only causing damage to the epidermis. Now, it gets red, it may be painful, but it is a superficial damage. Usually the tissue will heal, regenerate from that stratum basale. The dead tissue goes away, right? We're sloughing off the tissue. You may have some peeling in addition to the normal sloughing off. Your second degree burns, as you see here in the center, is a damage to the epidermis and the upper portion of the dermis. Now remember, you've got that layer of epidermis that is connected to the underlying connective tissues in the dermis. So when you have a second degree burn, you have damaged the upper part of that dermis in addition to the epidermis, and it can cause some separation of the tissue as the inflammatory response results to try to fix the damaged tissue. You'll hear more about wound healing in your lecture. But one of the things that happens with the inflammatory response is fluids leak out from the underlying blood vessels, and as they do so, they accumulate in that space between the epidermis and the dermis, and it causes separation of those layers of tissues and creates what we know as a blister. So if you have a blister, you should just pop it, right? Get rid of all that stuff and it's going to heal faster. Heck no, don't pop that blister. That blister is an accumulation of fluid, and that fluid is going to be resorbed. That's your immune system trying to work. But if you pop that blister, you've created a hole in the barrier between the internal and the external environment. That's going to allow bacteria and other pathogens to get in and can cause an infection of those tissues. So leave that blister alone and let your immune system do what it's supposed to do. You might as well poke a hole in a condom, right? You just broke the barrier. And then your third degree burns are the most damaging of the burns that we are examining. In your third degree burns, your epidermis and the dermis have been destroyed. In some cases, the hypodermis and underlying muscular tissue as well. Your third degree burns, the barrier has been broken. The barrier has been destroyed. The underlying regenerative tissues have been destroyed. So in your third degree burns, typically the tissue has to be abraded or scrubbed off. You've destroyed the tissues that would create new tissue, new underlying cells, or new cells to become tissue. So very often a skin graft has to be done where tissues are removed from one part of the body and replaced onto the damaged area. It's very important when you have third degree burns to watch for excessive fluid loss, because you've lost the barrier that keeps the fluids in the body, and also the damage of infection is much, much greater with the third degree burn. And we'll take a brief look at body membranes. So membranes are simple organs. We'll examine the epithelial membranes, which include the cutaneous membrane. The cutaneous membrane was your skin. So a membrane is a barrier, right? So you've got, with these barriers, you've got epithelial sheets that are going to be bound to the underlying layers of connective tissue. You just saw that with the skin, your cutaneous membrane. Another type of epithelial tissues are mucous membranes. Mucous membranes are going to secrete mucus, which is a wet, sticky glycoprotein. And mucous membranes line open cavities, things areas that are open to the external environment. So think about your digestive system and your respiratory system. They are open passages. So the mucus that is secreted by these membranes keeps these passages lubricated and helps to protect them. And the third category, I'm sorry, wow, this mouse is touchy today. The third category are your serous membranes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those, so they have their own slide. Your serous membranes secrete a fluid that contains nutrients, but also helps to lubricate. Your serous membranes are going to line closed body cavities. They cover organs and they cover body cavities. So you have two layers of your serous membranes. Viscera means organs, so the visceral layer covers the organs, and parietal layers cover the cavities. So these are membranes that fold over each other very much like a balloon would if you pushed your hand down onto the surface of that balloon so that it surrounded it. So we're going to say that this balloon is a serous membrane and the hand is an organ. So if you push your hand down into that balloon, you can see that one layer surrounds the hand. The hand is the organ, so that is the visceral membrane. And this lines the space. So here you have space, right? That would be your cavity. So the outer layer would be your parietal serous membrane. This would be your cavity. This would be your visceral serous membrane. All of this area would be filled with serous fluid secreted by these membranes. So now think if this was the heart and that muscle is constantly contracting. This fluid secreted by these membranes prevents friction. So we have three serous membranes that we give specific names to. The pericardium is the one that we just used as our example. So here you have the pericardium, which is what we call the serous membrane surrounding the heart. So the parietal pericardium surrounds the cavity. The visceral pericardium lies on the surface of the heart itself. Between the two, you have the cavity, the space, filled with that serous fluid. Now, if something happens and that fluid begins to build up, so you have, say, pericarditis. Itis means inflammation. And these membranes begin to secrete excess fluids and the inflammatory response occurs. You have a buildup of fluid that's going to push against the heart itself and can constrict the free movement or contraction of that heart and can lead to complications. Now you're going to get a whole lot more of that when you get into anatomy too, but just get the big picture here, right? Okay, now you also have within the thoracic cavity serous membranes that line the lungs, and we give them the specific name of pleura. So the pleural membranes line the lungs and the thoracic cavity, known as the pleural cavity. So again, you have on the surface of the lung itself the visceral pleura, lining the cavity, the parietal pleura. And then lining the abdominal cavity and the organs within, we have the peritoneum. So the parietal peritoneum lines the abdominal cavity. The visceral peritoneum lies on the abdominal organs. Each of these serous membranes secretes that serous fluid into the space. All right, that's it for this one.